So this next story is from the iconic Ursula Le Guin, and you'll watch a short trailer that gives you an idea of her influence in the canon. She is a very well-known fantasy and science fiction writer, and a fantastic one at that. And this story is one of her lesser-known but still excellent ones, which is Coming of Age in Carhide. And this is set in a universe that she has established in another novel, The Left Hand of Darkness, which is the Hainish universe. So a little background there to contextualize what sort of dynamic we're looking at. In the Hainish lore, humans did not evolve on Earth, but evolved on Hain. And this happened, millions of years ago, and then the people of Hain colonized other planets in the universe, including Earth, and also a planet called Gethin. Now, most distinctly, in Gethin, we are questioning, remember, Alien is about those social, cultural, identity-based characteristics and the other, and in this example, we are looking at gender and sexuality specifically. So, this story is also a great example of world building, meaning there's not a lot of explicit exposition about what the world is. There's also a lot of terms that are part of their language, right? Like Kemmerhaus or, Wumsib or things like that you sort of have to get a sense of this world by being immersed in it. But one of the fundamental differences between the people, the Hain descendants on Earth and the Hain descendants on Gethin is their gender and sex. So in this story, we are removing the idea of a fixed gender or a fixed biological sex characteristic. Not only are people able to exist as both men and women, they actually can procreate as both men and women, and they can transition back and forth between, male and female reproductive anatomy. And that is a really interesting concept in terms of how the other and gender works, particularly today when, we have such a more nuanced cultural conversation about those ideas. It also is a really interesting speculative universe to consider what a world would look like if gender and or sexuality was not the foundation of continuing the species. So in this on this planet, the beings have a hybrid genitalia, which is a very interesting name you'll discover shortly, and they are able to sort of serve both and be both and neither at the same time. And it's really interesting to think about the way you read the characters, knowing that and knowing that that's part of their biological makeup, and the consider the sort of implications that we can draw from that as people who do have fixed characteristics, but also differences in terms of how we interpret things like gender and sex. Now, it is interesting to note that in the lore of Gethin, there is no war, there is no rape, there is no marriage. There is no difference in like a mother-father role. Children are raised communally. People live in houses with, all of their cousins. People don't know who their father was because of the way that reproduction happens on this planet, which I don't want to spoil too much. You'll learn about shortly. The story also deals with the classic trope of coming of age. So coming-of-age stories usually deal with a young person moving from childhood to adulthood in some way. Usually this happens by an epiphany or a loss of innocence. Now, this can and often is an epiphany that reveals something sort of disillusioning or disappointing about the world, particularly in literary or non-sci-fi literature. It's usually they get bummed out about the world they actually live in. But in Le Guin's story, it's really interesting that this coming of age seems to start in this really disillusioned place and end up somewhere completely different. As well, of course, a loss of innocence or a coming of age story can be about a sexual awakening. It's not always, but it can, and that's certainly what the story involves. And the idea of coming of age in a world where there is where with this really interesting gender and sexuality system, that's what this story is looking at. It's very different from the way that love and relationships and, gender identity work here. Or, in human here. So as you're reading, though, I want you to pay attention to the way that the narrator describes, her feelings in coming into sexual maturity. And I'm using their feelings coming into sexual maturity, my mistake. Because I think you will find that they mimic in a lot of ways those sort of very uncomfortable, awkward, alien feeling years of puberty. And oftentimes, things like aliens and monsters in sci-fi are used as part of a as part of that young coming of age experience. And that is because that's a point in your life where you do feel very alien and monstrous and perhaps isolated and foreign to the world, and confused about your own body, and all of those things are speaking to many of the same ideas that aliens play in science fiction literature. It's also really interesting to think about the way that they talk about sex. In this story, specifically, they refer to, they find it dehumanizing. That is before Kemmer, but I think that's an interesting sort of callback to what differences culturally, worldview-wise, socially, the way that lifestyle would be, what those differences look like when something as sort of small and, massive as gender and sexual orientation are taken away. And that's an interesting thing to think about. So as with all of our alien stories, you want to think about how this can apply, in how we can translate those themes or translate those ideas to real world situations, and what they tell us about our interest in the other and cultural difference today.